We're going to be starting momentarily. If the witnesses will turn on their cameras at this time, it would be appreciated. Thank you. Okay. Let me say good morning to all of you. The Subcommittee on Elections of the Committee on House Administration will now come to order. As we begin, I want to note, as we always do, that we are holding this hearing in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. For our witnesses joining us virtually, please keep your microphones muted when not speaking, and unmute yourself when recognized for your 5 minutes of testimony or when answering a question. Please also keep your camera on at all times. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements be made part of the record. I don't hear any objections, and so it is therefore ordered. We are here today to continue examining the harmful proliferation of election-related misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. We have begun to call this MDM. Today's hearing is the third the subcommittee has held this year discussing the threat posed by MDM, and we will continue shining a spotlight on what has become an all-too-common occurrence, the spread of false information and misleading information about our elections, the integrity of our elections and the democratic process, and the targeting of Americans in an attempt to sow divisions and distrust. This committee has focused on several facets of the MDM issue, including examining the impact of election-related MDM on the Spanish-speaking and Latino communities, the impact of election-related MDM on communities of color, and the damage MDM has done to American democracy. Today, we will examine the sources of misinformation and disinformation, both foreign and domestic. In past elections, much attention was paid to foreign influence campaigns targeted at presidential and electoral politics, and with good reason, I might say. As the Senate Intelligence Committee reported, in the 2016 election, no group of Americans was targeted more by Russian Internet Research Agency disinformation than were African Americans. At a February roundtable in Florida and our April hearing on the targeting of MDM at communities of color, we learned more about how MDM can begin here at home, cycle through social media pages abroad, and then back to the United States. However, as we have seen all too clearly, disinformation campaigns also begin here at home. Domestic MDM campaigns are prolific and can be exceptionally dangerous. In June, the Department of Homeland Security issued a national system advisory bulletin stating that as the midterms approach, calls for violence by domestic violent extremists directed at democratic institutions and political candidates and party offices and election events and even election workers will likely increase. This troubling warning highlights the risk that election-related disinformation, regardless of the source, continues to pose. The perpetuation of disinformation about election results, the elections process, and the integrity of U.S. elections has led to violence against the Capitol, and we know about that all too painfully. We know about that. And the death of police officers, a rise in threats against election officials, and an undermining of faith in the democratic process. And the spread of this bad information just continues. And so today our witnesses will discuss the foreign and domestic origins of disinformation, how they interact and the dangers they pose, and how we can respond. As voters head to the polls in the remaining primaries and as election officials prepare for the November election, it is critical that Americans are provided with complete information and current information and accurate information, and that local, state, and federal officials are prepared to monitor and respond to election-related MDM appropriately. And so I look forward to hearing from the witnesses joining us today and learning more about the continued spread of MDM and what we as a Congress can do to combat it. Thank you for listening. I will now recognize my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Stile, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I actually think it's a pertinent week to have a conversation about misinformation and the impact that has, in particular, as you noted, on Hispanic communities, minority communities, because everybody's getting clobbered by the economic policies of the Biden administration. And this week, we've seen the Biden administration double down on misleading rhetoric to mislead the American people as to what's happening from the economic policies of this administration. They started by pumping money into the economy, saying reckless spending in Washington will not cause inflation. When it caused inflation, they changed their gears. And they said the inflation is temporary and transitory. When it was no longer temporary and transitory, the Biden administration said, it's caused by Putin. When it was pointed out that this inflationary environment started long before the Putin invasion of Ukraine, they said, it's corporate greed. And then this week, when the economic data is very clear that Americans are suffering under one-party Democratic control, getting clobbered and punched in the face by higher gas prices, higher grocery prices, the Biden administration doubles down on the misinformation campaign. It is attempting to redefine the term recession, which has been very consistent. The past 10 recessions have all used the same term. That is 2 quarters of consecutive negative economic growth. But the Biden administration doesn't want the American people to know what's happening, although the American people are suffering from one-party Democratic control. And in particular, Mr. Chairman, I think it is noted that the people who are suffering the most are the least amongst us, including Hispanic and minority populations. So we continue to see disinformation from the Biden administration in one-party Democratic control that's clobbering the American people. So what could be better than a conversation today about the disinformation from this information? I hope we dig in because we've continued to see President Biden and Vice President Harris spread misinformation. They continue to attack election integrity legislation, saying it will, quote, suppress voters, even though the empirical data from the elections this cycle have proven them wrong. President Biden even managed to be called out by the Washington Post for his claims about the Georgia election law. Called out for the continued misinformation and disinformation from this administration. I remember back when this subcommittee had a hearing back in April focused on disinformation on Spanish language radio. There were a lot of concerns about Latinos hearing conservative viewpoints. I hope that suddenly we have the same level of concern regarding new reports that show left-wing billionaire George Soros is set to purchase 18 Hispanic radio stations spanning 10 different markets. As we've seen, Hispanic voters have had enough of Democrats' disastrous policies and want to focus on problems facing all of our communities. We saw Congresswoman Mayra Flores' district in Texas as an example. Their communities are sick of the lack of action at the border in addressing rising inflation. As you see, the American people understand what is happening here. Democrats are desperately trying to push misinformation, a narrative ahead of the November election because things aren't going the Democrats' way. The American people don't need the government telling them truth from fiction. They can decide that on their own. What the American people need is a government that leads. They need a government to champion policies that work for them. That's why full committee ranking member Rodney Davis introduced the American Confidence in Elections Act today to restore election integrity and build American voter confidence in our election process and outcomes. Unlike H.R. 1, which was crafted behind closed doors, the ACE Act has been in the works for over 2 years and is a product of many public conversations and meetings with folks who actually want to administer elections to learn what can be done to empower state legislators with the right tools to make meaningful reforms to our election laws, to determine what outdated federal policies we need to get out of the way. So if you're wondering where we'll be for the rest of this hearing, we'll be having a roundtable on the discussion over in the Capitol with members of Congress, state election officials, and key stakeholders to discuss how we can make elections run even better and ensure Americans have full faith in the process and outcomes, not undermining voter confidence by pushing misinformation as we see time and again from this administration. I thank the chair for holding today's hearing, and I yield back.
And we thank the ranking member. In just a moment, I will introduce today's witnesses, but before I do that, as a reminder to our witnesses, each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes, and that 5-minute presentation can go very quickly. Please be sure you can see the timer on your screen and are mindful of the 5-minute time limit. Please know that your entire written statements will be made part of the record, and the record will remain open for at least 5 days for additional materials that may be submitted. Again, welcome to each one of our witnesses. Joining us today is John Cohen. John is the former Acting Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security. Mark Juergensmeyer, and please excuse me because I know I'm mispronouncing the name. Mark is from the University of California, Santa Barbara. The next witness is Jiore Craig of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And last but certainly not least, Renee DiResta of the Stanford Internet Observatory. John Cohen is the former Acting Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Department of Homeland Security and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He has over 3.5 decades of experience in law enforcement, counterintelligence, and homeland security. Mark is a distinguished professor emeritus of sociology and global studies and founding director of the Orfalea, and I know I'm mispronouncing that, Center for Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is an expert on religious violence and conflict resolution, has published more than 300 articles and 30 books. Jiore Craig is the head of digital integrity at the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. She has extensive experience helping elected officials and political leaders and organizations and institutions across 5 continents to measure the impact of digital communication and influence campaigns on public opinion and communicate effectively in the wake of the threat of disinformation around elections. Renee is DiResta is the research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She investigates the spread of malign narratives across social networks. She assists policymakers in understanding and responding to the problem. She has studied disinformation and computational propaganda. I will now recognize each of the witnesses for 5 minutes. And Mr. Cohen, since you were first on my list, you will now go first. You have 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Stile, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the current threat facing the United States from foreign and domestic threat actors who use internet-based communication and information sharing platforms to engage in illicit and other activities harmful to our national security. I'm going to talk a little bit about the general threat environment and how that general threat environment impacts potentially the 2022 midterm elections. And I just want to say from the outset that my observations today are based, as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, on my 38 plus years working in law enforcement, homeland security, counterintelligence, and national security for both Republican and Democratic administrations. As we sit here today, law enforcement, intelligence, and security professionals across the United States are confronting a threat environment that I believe is the most volatile, complex, and dynamic of any that I've experienced in my career. It includes an unacceptable level of mass casualty attacks and acts of targeted violence. These attacks are typically conducted by lone offenders who engage in this violent activity inspired by extremist beliefs and/or personal grievances. And while the specific motive behind these attacks may often vary, analysis tells us that many of the attackers share common behavioral characteristics. In particular, they are angry, they feel socially disconnected, they're seeking a sense of life meaning, and they spend significant time online, ultimately self-connecting with a cause or grievance to justify the use of violence as a way to express their anger. They use content they find online to justify, inform, plan, and prepare for attacks, and they will often discuss their intent to engage in violence online in both open and closed forums. Fueling this violence is an online and media ecosystem that is saturated with conspiracy theories and other content purposely placed there by foreign and domestic threat actors, including foreign intelligence services, international terrorist groups, domestic violent extremists, and criminal organizations. These threat actors seek to exploit the fractures, anger, and discord in our society by using social media and other online communication platforms to spread disinformation, conspiracy theories, rhetoric, and other false narratives. From an information operations perspective, their hope is that these carefully chosen socio-political narratives will spread rapidly across the social media and internet, eventually becoming amplified by mainstream public figures so that they are consumed by the broadest number of people possible. Operationally, they seek to sow discord, undermine confidence in government and democratic institutions, diminish our standing in the global community, destabilize our society, and yes, at times inspire violence. Once introduced, this content will migrate across the online and media ecosystem where it is consumed by a broad cross-section of Americans. They see it, they believe it, they spread it, and at times they even act on it. In some cases, the reaction to this content may be legal and even constitutionally protected, but in other cases, the reaction can include acts of targeted violence, destructive behavior, and other illegal activity. Recent attacks have targeted a cross-section of our society. People and facilities have been targeted because of their faith, political beliefs, race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. Other times, attackers have targeted locations where large numbers of people gather, such as retail, entertainment, or transportation facilities. In other instances, these attacks and plots were directed at law enforcement and government officials. Recent content promoted on extremist and terrorist forums have called for attacks against transportation and mass transit hubs, healthcare facilities and personnel, faith-based organizations, drinking and wastewater facilities, commercial facilities, law enforcement personnel, election officials, and government officials from both parties. And the same content has provided guidance on how best to conduct those attacks. As the 2022 election draws closer, law enforcement officials are concerned about potential acts of violence at the publicly accessible parts of the physical election infrastructure, campaign-associated events, polling places, and registration events. Additionally, we've seen increased threats directed at election officials. There are a number of things that we need to be focused on doing. We need to think differently about how we gather intelligence. As you'll hear today, important information about the threat is also often available on public forums. Second, we need to make sure that those responsible for protecting our communities are given the information they need to do so. Our nation is more vulnerable to information warfare attacks because of the anger, division, and discord that has become all too common within our political process and public discourse. We can be passionate advocates for our political views and not succumb to the conspiracy theories or view our neighbors as the enemy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
We thank the gentleman for his testimony. The next witness is Mr. Juergensmeyer. You are now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Juergensmeyer, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Juergensmeyer, I understand that you get the prize for calling in from the longest distance from Washington, D.C., but you will still have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I've just figured that out.
There you go. Take it away, please.
I study radical movements around the world, from ISIS and Al-Qaeda to the QAnon movement, and my approach is worldview analysis, which means I try to get inside the mindset of people who are doing these things. And so when they use misinformation, I'm trying to understand why. How does this fit into their worldview? And I found several answers. And one is that this gives the illusion of power. So when the mob poured into the Capitol on January 6th and they took over the space of the Capitol, they felt that they, rather than the elected officials, had the right to be there. It gave a sense of empowerment. And in Myanmar, I talked with the Buddhist monk who was advocating violence against Muslims. And he had this theory that he was advocating, that the Muslims were trying to replace Buddhists as the dominant culture of Myanmar, which is ridiculous. But nonetheless, it empowered a lot of people. It made them feel, that's what's really going on. This replacement theory that he had gave them a sense of power. And so this illusion of power is very strong. And it sometimes leads to more than that. And that's the second point, that it's often more than just an illusion. It's a part of a real strategy to try to take control, to try to actually change the political process. And we've seen this in the January 6th hearing, where the mob felt like it was empowered by being there, but the whole event was a part of a larger strategy to try to change the political process. And this is also true in Syria and Iraq, where they actually did change the political process. When I talked with ISIS militants, some of them in prison, they told me that one of the first steps in ISIS takeover of that region of the world was misinformation, was to spread the rumor that the Shia governments in Damascus and Baghdad were evil. They're not just bad people, they were agents of the devil. And being agents of the devil, they were worthy of being destroyed, and you could do anything with them. And this gave a great sense of power, but also was a part of the transformation, so that when ISIS came to power, even people who didn't like its religious rhetoric, they respect the fact they were Sunnis and they were taking care of those evil Shia. It was a part of this larger struggle. And this leads to my third point, this imagined struggle, this great war that's imagined in the background of a lot of the disinformation that legitimizes it. Because if you think you're at war is an extraordinary construct that turns civil society upside down. It legitimizes all kinds of things. So if you think you're at war, that makes possible spies and lies and everything else. And then we saw this again in the January 6th hearings. And this is particularly true if you think that God is on your side. I once had the occasion to talk with one of the leaders of Hamas, who got in an argument with him over whether suicide attacks really worked against the military might of Israel. I was saying, this is one of the largest military powers in the Middle East. This is not going to really defeat them. And the Hamas leader looked at me and he said, well, maybe not in my lifetime, and maybe not in my children's lifetime, but in my children's lifetime, we might succeed, because this is not our war. This is God's war. And if it's God's war, we cannot lose. So if you think you're a part of God's war, then not only is disinformation legitimate and you're trying to make, delegitimize the government, but it also it empowers you thinking that eventually you will win. This conviction behind a lot of misinformation that there's a hidden war going on, more that we cannot see. But misinformation is a tactic in that war. And if it's God's war, well, you cannot lose. So I appreciate hearing my comments, and I look forward to the discussion and any questions you might have.
And we thank you as well. This time, the chair recognizes Ms. Craig for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Style, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jiore Craig, and I'm the head of digital integrity at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where I oversee our work around elections. I've spent 9 years as a public opinion researcher examining how foreign and domestic actors use social media during elections to deceive their publics. My experience includes hundreds of elections in the United States and more than a dozen other countries abroad. I hope you will take one big point away from my testimony today. Disinformation targeting voters remains a significant threat, not only to our own citizens, but to citizens and democracies worldwide. We will only counter it effectively if we look at the systems, policies, product features, and business models that drive the actions of social media companies and those sourcing disinformation, instead of merely chasing after the false or pernicious content that specific disinformation campaigns promote. While it is impossible to know the precise breakdown of foreign versus domestic disinformation efforts, due in large part to a lack of transparency on the part of the social media platforms, ISD research suggests domestic disinformation targets Americans at a higher volume and frequency than foreign campaigns. Electoral disinformation has become a global enterprise, and each election serves as a petri dish for experimenting and learning from fellow disinformation entrepreneurs' global experiences. My written testimony summarizes the nature of recent domestic disinformation tactics, as well as recent foreign state-sponsored and foreign commercial disinformation attempts. Anyone can decide to pursue disinformation tactics for profit, and anyone can hire commercial actors to use disinformation tactics to influence an election. The online presence of such actors can be as anonymous and profitable as laws and platform policies allow. Consider the following report of domestic disinformation. Research in 2020 found a website purporting to represent an organization called Protect My Vote. This so-called organization was allowed to run a digital ad campaign with more than 150 ads aiming to erode trust in mail-in voting. Some of the paid posts featured an image of LeBron James and falsely claimed he had expressed concerns about the use of mail-in voting. Facebook eventually removed the page for engaging in voter suppression tactics. This example features tactics and systems common to many successful disinformation campaigns, including misleading organization names, the unauthorized use of trusted messengers, hidden sources of advertising funds, as well as Facebook's election policies and advertising model in action. In our country and in other democracies, there is understandably an intense focus on the content of electorally focused disinformation efforts. But this focus on content can obscure the role of systems at play in enabling disinformation. Recent reporting demonstrates that the way social media companies make business decisions about what to show Americans around elections has a significant impact on how successful disinformation campaigns are in reaching Americans. This is why it is so important to focus on the systemic aspects of disinformation on social media. There are two key reasons that a focus on disinformation content often eclipses disinformation systemic forces. First, most of us primarily experience disinformation as content. Voters, journalists, researchers have extremely easy access to disinformation on a day-to-day basis. It is much harder to obtain information about the hidden systems that enable such disinformation, like who is paying for the content, who is making money from a person engaging with the content, or whether the accounts sharing content are neighbors, foreign citizens, or fake accounts. This opacity is no accident. Social media companies and bad actors are intentionally not transparent with much of this information, likely to obscure the systems at play, enabling them to profit or benefit from disinformation. The second reason the conversation tends to focus on content rather than systemic dynamics is because many stakeholders in the disinformation marketplace want to center free speech protections naturally evoked in a debate focused on content. Unfortunately, this approach does not protect free speech, which should be defended at all costs, but instead help stakeholders avoid responsibility for the systems they rely on, which, if examined, would likely lead to further protections for speech. If we continue to stay focused on content alone and not on systems, those spreading disinformation will continue using social media to take full advantage of the product features enabling their successful, profitable campaigns. I urge those trying to understand how disinformation targets Americans to shift their focus away from content alone and toward the systems moving disinformation into Americans' news feeds. We cannot just debate which meme is more rooted in fact, or we will stay frozen in false debate around content where only those benefiting from disinformation win and the American people lose. We need to debate which systems at play in disinformation should change to end the downward spiral of trust that Americans have started to have in their own democracy and, even more important, in each other. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
And we thank you. This time the chair recognizes Ms. DiResta. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Butterfield, Ranking Member Style, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Renee DiResta, and I'm the research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is a cross-disciplinary program for research, teaching, and policy engagement focused on use and abuse of information technologies. While I'm here in an individual capacity, I'll discuss our work with other research collaborators on a project called the Election Integrity Partnership, or EIP, a nonpartisan coalition of research organizations established in 2020 that jointly studied the dynamics of false and misleading narratives during the 2020 election. The EIP attempts to meet a need for independent, non-governmental observation and analysis of high potential for harm rumors that may suppress voting, confuse voters about election processes, or delegitimize election results without evidence. Findings are shared with partners and in public reports posted online. I want to highlight 3 key takeaways from our 2020 research. First, the rapid spread of information between users and media accounts on social media can cause rumors to widely circulate, creating a false impression before the facts are known. Second, in 2020, the spread of misleading election narratives was both top-down, originating from media and prominent figures, and bottom-up, with claims from everyday people amplified by influential accounts. And third, a whole of society approach is needed to identify election-related rumors shared online, to analyze their capacity for harm, and to responsibly communicate accurate, up-to-date information to constituents in service to facilitating an informed electorate. I think we've all been using some terms, and I'm going to define the way that we use ours. Misinformation is false, but not shared with an intent to mislead. It is at times used as an umbrella category for things like false rumors. Disinformation is false or misleading information purposefully spread to further an objective. It sometimes uses inauthentic accounts or manipulative means of dissemination, and it is a systems problem. What we observed in our process in 2020 is that intent is complicated, and assessing the facts behind rapidly evolving viral claims is a significant challenge as they are going viral. And that is why I've begun to refer to rumors. Uncorroborated or disputed information that quickly spreads, often originating on social channels and progressing to media pickup. Now, some rumors turn out to be true, and this is why, again, focusing on content is not ideal. However, the viral speed of social media engagement means that rumors gain public awareness long before the facts are known, creating an impression that may turn out to be false. EIP attempts to build awareness of rumors and narratives so that state and local election officials can determine whether to investigate and respond to the claims to best inform the public in the election environment. Social media companies similarly independently determine whether flagged content appears to violate their policies, and if so, whether to take any action. But one of the challenges to taking action is that most of what we saw in the 2020 election was not what has come to be known as coordinated inauthentic behavior. It was not foreign interference, and it was not large networks of fake accounts. While China, Russia, and Iran did work around the edges, amplifying claims that America was in disarray and creating false stories and front media properties and misattributed email campaigns, a key takeaway from EIP's observation of the 2020 election is that most of the viral, false, and misleading claims that sought to delegitimize the election outcome originated from and were amplified by Americans, including prominent partisan political influencers. In other words, misleading narratives were not only top-down of the sort of long-standing partisan propaganda, but they were also very much bottom-up, in which individuals found found moments that they saw in their real daily lives, took photos of them, posted them to social media, tried to figure out what was going on. Prominent influencers often came in, they took that content, they amplified it, creating a perception of allegations of fraud to create a narrative that widespread fraud was happening, again, absent any evidence. And while the EIP was intended to assess the dynamics by which these rumors moved, the specific content is less relevant to than the conditions that created it. So I've entered some recommendations in with my written testimony, but ultimately we need collaborative tech and researcher efforts to try to understand the dynamics of viral rumors, and we need to enable civil society and government voices to provide up-to-date information or to transparently inform the public that we just don't know all of the facts yet. We need media literacy efforts, and we need meaningful transparency from social media sites for the public and for researchers and civil society to enable public accountability and understanding. The spread of viral, false, and misleading claims with the intent to delegitimize democratic elections remains a significant problem, one with real-world consequences, and it requires a multi-stakeholder approach to mitigation. Doing nothing is not an option. Thank you for having me here today.
And we thank you for your testimony. Now it's time for member questions. The chair will first recognize Ms. Ledger Fernandez for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Butterfield. And unlike some of our colleagues from the other side of the aisle, I truly believe that addressing and having a hearing with regards to misinformation and its perils is essential. As we heard before, the mentiras, the lies about our elections that proliferate on TV, online, and elsewhere, serve to weaken our beloved democracy, as we discussed when we were in Florida about the lies that propagate and are targeted to our Spanish-speaking, my beautiful Spanish-speaking comunidad. They not only undermine democracy, but they are basically killing people because they propagate false lies about important health concerns. And then we've spent a summer listening to the January 6th committee lay out how lies about that election led citizens of the United States to violently attack our Capitol. So this hearing is important, and I thank you for it. We need to make sure we always put people above politics. We need to make sure we put people in a democracy above the power and above the power of any one individual. Mr. Juergensmeyer, you've studied extremism throughout the world. Who are the most effective messengers when it comes to getting the truth out and dispelling disinformation so that the people really do get the information they need to be able to vote, to be able to participate in our democracy without the distortions that we've heard about in today's hearing?
Well, thank you. It's a good question. Of course, the media plays a very important role, but so does social media. And what I've discovered, to my horror, really, that most of my students these days pick up their news information not from newspapers or television programs, but from social media and from channels, particular podcasts that they might be listening to. So these informal means or less formal means of communication are very important. How to affect that, how to get the voice out, it becomes more complicated in the digital age. I accept that, but it certainly merits our attention, and it's worth trying to cut through the fog and to address what you rightly identified as a very serious problem.
Thank you so much. And now I want to get to what can we do here in Congress that is that could be effective and that is within our power and authority to protect our democracy. Mr. Cohen, you described how disinformation exploits existing divisions and, as we've seen, can lead to physical violence. What are your thoughts on the role that Congress could play in the short term and the long term to keep our elections secure and accessible?
I think there's several things that Congress can do. First, when we think about intelligence and how we discuss intelligence operations at the congressional level, whether it's through House and Senate Intel or some of the oversight committees, it's understanding that from an intelligence perspective, while we may not need to rely on sensitive covert collection and analytic capabilities that are employed by the intelligence community, there's important information gathering and analysis that needs to take place. And we should be thinking about how organizations like the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, can work closer with some of the organizations, quite frankly, represented on this panel. Also, Congress needs to, in its oversight role, ensure that those who are engaged in this information gathering and analysis are doing it in a way that is protective of privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights. Our job is not to police thought, but our job in law enforcement and in the security world is to protect against threats of violence against our communities. Additional funding for community-based crime prevention or violence prevention activities, and some of the other media literacy activities that were referenced by some of my colleagues on this panel. And then finally, to your point, Congresswoman, and I think it's a critical point, is what the adversaries hope to do is to have these socio-political narratives mainstreamed. They want folks in the public figures to mimic their socio-political narratives. It gives them validation, and it may actually provide justification for those who seek to act on those narratives. So if we can lower the temperature of our political discourse, that would go a big way.
Right, and when we start putting people in our democracy above politics or power, we can start doing that. My time is up. I noted that I wanted to ask some questions with regards to disinformation targeted to the Spanish language community. But Mr. Chairman.
You're given one additional minute.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I also want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the report written by the Election Integrity Partnership entitled The Long Fuse, Misinformation in the 2020 Election, which Ms. DiResta discussed in her testimony, and which details the process and findings regarding misinformation in the 2020 election and recommendations for future actions.
That's a mouthful, without objection.
It is a long thing. And, well, if I do I have that minute, Mr. Chairman?
The lady has an additional minute.
Hi, muchísimas gracias for that. Mr. Craig, you talked about the need for systemic change to counter disinformation. Why have these companies not done more, and especially with regards to the Spanish language disinformation?
Thank you for the question. While I'm not inside the minds of social media CEOs, I have to imagine that everything they do is about their bottom line. So, for example, they have not signaled that they will invest resources in looking at how their policies affect Spanish speakers. And in fact, they've not done that. They haven't done a good job in English. They don't do a good job for their Spanish speaking voters or users, and they don't do a good job for Americans who speak other languages. We know that those non-English language speakers are at a disproportional risk because the policies that are already poorly enforced are especially not enforced when it comes to their cases. So I wish we had the information about how their business models are tied to their policies being enforced when it comes to Spanish language disinformation, but we don't have that information. And that's why I encourage the committee and I encourage Congress to look at exploring how to get more information and require the platforms to be more transparent about how their systems and their business models are correlated with harms that are targeting American voters.
Thank you so much. We have to make sure we have people over profits. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I understand Mr. Aguilar may be arriving momentarily, and so I'll just go ahead and put myself next and hope that he arrives very quickly. Let me just first direct my first question to Ms. DiResta. Thank you for your testimony today, and thank you, more importantly, for the work that you do every day in making sure that our elections are free and fair. Ms. DiResta, in your testimony, you stated that a whole-of-society approach. Now, society is pretty massive. A whole-of-society approach is needed to identify, analyze, and respond to election-related rumors. Tell me, if you will, in your experience working with Election Integrity Partnership, what does that whole-of-society approach look like? Help me with that, please.
Thank you for the question. I think Senator Warner is one of the people who originated the term, and I find it very appealing because it really gets at the fact that this is something that impacts all of us and that we all have a role to play here. So in the Election Integrity Partnership, we have academic institutions that look at public data to try to understand what is moving along the structure of social media and its intersection with media. Again, that structure is separate from the content, from the substance, but we try to understand the dynamics of both the spread and the rhetoric and content. So we have a very kind of academic approach to that. But of course, one of the challenges is that it is not enough to say this exists and this looks like it violates a platform policy, or this looks like it is false and misleading. We are not equipped to make that determination. And so the whole of society aspect is civil society partners and fact-checking organizations and media can do that work of trying to figure out the ground truth. Election officials, particularly at a state and local level, can assess some of these rumors and determine whether or not, for example, a Sharpie marker was a valid way to mark a ballot, and they can put out a statement about that. Tech platforms can determine if viral, false, and misleading claims rise to a level, a threshold of causing harm that would justify either a label or throttling while the facts are found, or in some extreme cases, a takedown. And so we have this process, this joint collaborative effort by which each different stakeholder type brings something to the table. And I think one of the most important, as one of the prior questioners asked, is this question of who is most equipped to counterspeak, who is most equipped to tell the truth to the public in a way that the public is going to receive. The answer there is often not the government, and it is often not academics. And so the partnerships with civil society organizations enable a thorough understanding of what is happening in that moment to inform the counter speech, the counter contribution, the fact check, the clarification that state and local officials or civil society might wish to put out to keep the public informed.
Thank you. Mr. DiResta, let me just ask you a different question. It's not on my script, but it just occurred to me that last week here in the Washington metro area, I was watching television last week, and one of the paid commercials said, "Please call your congressman right away. Congress is planning to take $500 billion out of your Medicare program." And that is absolutely not correct. What the commercial was suggesting was that Congress is debating ways to save money in the Medicare program up to and perhaps $500 billion. And that is alarming to someone who's not watching this very closely. Would that be characterized as misinformation or disinformation? We are trying to find creative ways of taking $500 billion out of the Medicare program with savings, but not in any way that would affect the care provided to patients. And I thought that was so disingenuous the way that commercial was framed. What do you say about that?
Well, I think that we want to differentiate a little bit between, as you note, something that's obviously falsifiable and something where there's a grain of truth, and so that truth is spun. And political spin is something that we've had in our politics since the founding of the Republic. And our mechanism for dealing with it has been traditionally counterspeech. And so again, I think that the dynamic is we want to understand where those narratives are, particularly as they are often siloed in a channel, in a social media group, to bring that, that dynamic forward to the public so that the people who know the truth, who know the facts, who can clarify what's happening, have the capacity to address that. So I don't think that mis and disinformation, I think those terms are often asked to do things that they're really not necessarily intended to do. And so the scope creep in the term then erodes our understanding of the problem. I do think that propaganda and political spin, remain dynamics in our politics and always will.
Thank you for that. And again, the commercial that I made reference to last week, I can just imagine an 85-year-old senior sitting at home in her chair, seeing a commercial and believing it to be true, suggesting that all of this money is going to be taken out of her Medicare account, which will deprive her of health care, I think is very dangerous and disingenuous, to say the least. Thank you for your testimony. At this time, the chair will now recognize Mr. Aguilar, the gentleman from California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the importance of this topic. Mr. Juergensmeyer, the intelligence community has made it abundantly clear that domestic extremists, specifically those that are racially or ethnically motivated, present the biggest threat. Can you share why the rise of domestic extremism is a threat in the upcoming 2022 election?
Well, domestic as opposed to foreign groups. And it's true that foreign groups have really, they have a lot of interest in delegitimizing the America and American government. And ISIS, take ISIS, for example, and its very sophisticated digital media. But domestic groups have very specifically a lot to gain. And there's a lot to gain in the sense of giving them a false sense of power, but also a strategy to try to take power. And so these are real threats, as the January 6 hearings have very clearly shown, and they need to be taken quite seriously.
Thank you. Ms. Gregg, in an October 2020 NBC News article, you mentioned that some of the misinformation tactics you're concerned about are coming from micro-influencers and those who utilize platforms like Instagram Live. Can you elaborate on how micro-influencers, both foreign and domestic, utilize misinformation tactics and how that correlates with voter suppression?
Sure. So another smart question was asked in relation to this, which is who is useful in talking to people about what information they're receiving about elections. Micro-influencers usually are built up to blend in with a social media user's environment. They often reference local language that is specific to a individual community. Maybe they're talking about sports teams, and they feel more like a friend. They feel more like a member of your community, someone you can trust. They don't have huge followings. They have somewhat smaller followings, and that small following usually has very high engagement in what they're saying. So sometimes these people are genuine Americans, or they are foreign sources pretending to be Americans. Sometimes they look like news sites. Sometimes they look like interest sites, like they could be talking about music, or they could be talking about recipes. And they will slip in information about the election and intentionally have that coming from a source that the audience has grown to trust. When it comes to voter suppression, or really any mis or disinformation about election processes or how to vote, when to vote, the best day to vote, the best time to vote, when it comes to any of that information, it's going to be easier to digest, and it's not going to be questioned critically by the person looking at it if they trust that user. So as we see more and more people using platforms like Instagram, like TikTok, where influencer culture is very common, it gets more and more challenging to keep track of all the different micro-influencers or alleged micro-influencers that are trying to influence their opinion on the election.
Do you have concerns on how that can be used on platforms that children may utilize, or teenagers may utilize, whether it's conversations about the future of democracy, or I was specifically taking how you mentioned specific things kind of inserted in the middle of a cooking discussion or of something that is unrelated. Do you have concerns about a segment of population, teenagers, young adults, and how they're prone to use these platforms?
I do. When I think about young people using social media today, it really makes me feel a little sick to my stomach because of all the online harm that really is moving across these platforms with very little regard to the age of the end user. Not as related to election disinformation, but we've seen countless reporting come out about platform harms targeting younger users. And as we see some platforms like Meta-owned Instagram move to be more like TikTok, move to incorporate more video, we know that we're going to have an even harder time looking at that content, because it is extremely difficult to look at video content. And we know that a lot of younger users are the reason that they're making those changes, so they can attract more young people and keep them on their product. I will say there is no one profile of person who is most susceptible to disinformation. It takes advantage of people's mental states. So whether you're a young person and all your friends are on the platform, or whether you're a person who's lonely and you're looking for content to sort of keep you engaged with some type of community, in any case, it can target any type of person. But I do have very specific concerns about the way the platforms have not made age considerations much of a priority to date.
Thank you. Thank you for the answers. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a July 18th, 2022 working paper released by the Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center entitled, quote, "President Trump is calling us to fight: what the court documents reveal about the motivations behind January 6th and networked incitement." in which this analysis of over 450 charging and sentencing documents shows that while a variety of factors motivated the rioters, the largest faction of defendants were motivated to come to D.C. by either their desire to support then-President Trump, their concerns about the integrity of the 2020 election, or some combination of both.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
And we thank you as well, Mr. Aguilar. I think this may conclude all of the questions from the members. Other members had to step away and will not return. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony today and thank the members certainly for their questions. Members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for these witnesses, and if so, we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The hearing record will be held open for those responses. Again, thank you to everyone for your participation today. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Elections stands adjourned.